There is a specific kind of fatigue that does not come from overwork. You have felt it. The afternoon hours in a room that has been lit since morning by the same ceiling panels, that flat, directionless brightness that casts no real shadows, that comes from nowhere and goes nowhere, that has no color at the edges and no warmth at the center. You are not tired because you have done too much. You are tired in a way that feels strangely sourceless, as though something that should have happened today simply did not. A low-grade wrongness that you would not call suffering and cannot quite call discomfort. You reach for coffee, for movement, for a screen with brighter contrast. And the wrongness persists, because what you are missing is not stimulation. What you are missing is information. Your body has been waiting all day for a signal that never arrived. The room was bright, but the room was not telling the truth. You have spent the day inside a physical approximation of sunlight, and your skin, your blood vessels, your cellular machinery, and the pressure inside your arteries all know the difference. They have known the difference for 400 million years. You have known it for perhaps 60 at most. Stand somewhere that sunlight actually reaches you, if you can, even now. A window that the direct beam comes through. Outside, if that is possible. Let the light fall on the skin of your forearm or the back of your hand. Skin that has been covered all day. Notice what you notice. Perhaps nothing obvious yet. That is appropriate. What is happening is not happening at the scale where human perception operates. It is happening at the scale of individual photons striking individual molecules embedded in the surface layer of your skin. A transaction so small that the mass involved is essentially zero. And yet the cascade that follows from that transaction reaches organs your biology would never have thought to connect to a patch of arm skin. Not until the evidence made the connection undeniable. You have just placed your skin inside a field of information that your body has been parsing since before it had a spine. Something is already being read. Here is the paradox that should stop you cold. The skin on the back of your hand, the 2 or 3 square centimeters currently receiving sunlight, contains no neurons in any meaningful density. It cannot think. It has no direct line to the brain in the way that your eyes do, in the way that your gut does. And yet what happens when ultraviolet light strikes it triggers a biological response so systemic, so far-reaching, so precisely orchestrated that pharmaceutical researchers have spent decades and billions of dollars trying to replicate it, without ever matching the precision, the range, or the elegance of what sunlight produces in a few minutes on your skin for free. The paradox is one of scale. Human intuition was calibrated for medium-sized objects. You push a lever and you feel the force. You throw a stone and you watch it travel. Cause and effect at the same scale, visible to the same observer. But the physics of the body operates at ranges your intuition was never built to navigate. A single ultraviolet photon, a packet of energy so small it has no meaningful mass, strikes a molecule of 7-dehydrocholesterol in your skin. The energy from that collision reorganizes the molecular structure of that compound into pre-vitamin D3. The reorganization takes picoseconds. It happens silently, invisibly, at a scale 10,000 times smaller than a red blood cell. And what starts there ends 3 or 4 metabolic steps later, as a steroid hormone that enters the nucleus of cells in your heart, your brain, your immune system, and your pancreas, and changes which genes those cells are reading. One photon, one molecular collision, a gene expression change in your cardiac tissue. How is that possible? That is not intuition-friendly physics. That is the physics of the cellular body, where scale relativity makes mockery of what feels proportionate. What would you have predicted before you knew this? You would have predicted that skin absorbs light, gets warm, perhaps gets darker. You would not have predicted endocrine signaling. The astonishment here is not rhetorical decoration. It is the signal that your previous model of skin was wrong. Skin was not a wrapper. It was a transducer. And the question that follows from that, one that the science is still working through in ways more surprising than the vitamin D story alone, is, What else is it transducing? If you have been subscribing to this channel, you already know that the smallest gestures carry disproportionate biological weight. If you are new here, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what follows in this script will reframe something you see every single day without recognizing what it actually is. Here is what your skin is, before we talk about what sunlight does to it. The epidermis, the outermost layer of skin, the part that sunlight actually reaches, is approximately 1/10 of a millimeter thick. On a standard ruler, that is invisible, thinner than a sheet of printer paper. And within that invisible thickness, there are roughly 15 to 20 layers of cells stacked in a gradient of transformation. At the base, living cells actively dividing. At the surface, cells that have completed their transformation into flat, dead, keratin-filled plates that interlock like the scales of a fish and form the waterproof barrier that keeps you from dissolving in rain. This is not metaphor. This is structural engineering. The outermost cells are not alive. They are armor. But here is what the textbook version quietly omits. In 2008, Ralph Paus and his team at the University of Hamburg published findings that forced a revision of one of the most basic assumptions in the field. The assumption was this: light-sensitive molecular machinery, the opsins, the melanopsin receptors, the photoreceptive proteins that detect light and initiate biological responses, that machinery was retinal. It lived in the eye. It belonged to vision. The skin could be affected by light in crude, brute force ways, heat, sunburn, tanning, but it did not sense light. It did not have the molecular vocabulary for it. Except it did. Keratinocytes, the dominant cell type of the epidermis, the cell that undergoes that transformation from living divider to dead armor plate, express functional melanopsin, the same protein your retinal ganglion cells use to detect non-visual light and entrain your circadian rhythm to the day-night cycle. Your skin cells have the hardware for photoreception. They are not eyes, but they are not blind either. They are reading the spectrum of light that reaches them, and they are responding to what they read with a specificity that no artificial light source in history has correctly reproduced. The razor sentence for what skin physically is: the epidermis is a self-renewing photosensitive semiconductor, a layered solid that converts incident electromagnetic radiation into structured chemical signals with a spectral selectivity that took evolution 400 million years to calibrate. Hold that for a moment, not as metaphor. Semiconductor. The physics of energy conversion in living tissue operates by principles that overlap directly with the physics of photovoltaic devices, with one critical difference. Silicon converts photon energy into electron flow. Skin converts photon energy into molecular reconfiguration and hormonal cascade. The input is the same kind of energy. The output is biology rather than electricity, but the underlying physics, a photon of sufficient energy striking a molecule in the right quantum state and causing a transition, that is the same physics. Your skin and a solar panel are doing a version of the same thing. One of them took 1 billion years of evolutionary iteration to build. The other took 50 years of materials science. The solar panel converts sunlight to electricity with roughly 20% efficiency. Evolution, working with living tissue and hormonal cascades rather than current and voltage, achieves effects that cascade through 12 organ systems simultaneously. Efficiency, in that comparison, becomes a category error. Now, here is what actually happens when a photon of ultraviolet B radiation, wavelength between 290 and 315 nanometers, a portion of the solar spectrum that glass blocks almost completely, strikes the molecule of 7-dehydrocholesterol in your skin. This is layer 1, the immediate transaction measured in picoseconds to seconds. The photon's energy is absorbed by the molecule. The ring structure of 7-dehydrocholesterol, a ring that has been biochemically conserved across vertebrate lineages for hundreds of millions of years, precisely because it is receptive to this wavelength, ruptures. This is not damage. This is the mechanism. The ring opens, a photolytic reaction driven by the energy of the photon, and the resulting compound is pre-vitamin D3. This happens in your skin, passively, without any decision or effort on your part, every time the relevant wavelength of sunlight reaches the relevant layer of your epidermis. The transaction is complete in picoseconds. Mass involved. Negligible. Energy involved. 1 photon. Consequence? The first step of a hormonal synthesis pathway. But simultaneously, and this is the part that Richard Weller at the University of Edinburgh began systematically investigating from around 2010, the UVA portion of the solar spectrum, wavelength 315 to 400 nanometers, is triggering an entirely different cascade in the same skin tissue. Nitric oxide. Sunlight causes the skin to release nitric oxide, a gaseous molecule that diffuses directly through cell membranes, enters the bloodstream, and causes smooth muscle in the walls of blood vessels to relax. Vasodilation. The vessels widen. Blood pressure drops. Within minutes of skin exposure to UVA sunlight, the cardiovascular system has been reconfigured. Weller and his colleagues at Edinburgh published data in 2014 showing that this effect is real, measurable, and significant. A reduction in blood pressure following UV skin exposure that is independent of vitamin D synthesis, independent of temperature, and independent of any behavioral change. The sunlight did it. The skin transmitted it. The blood vessels answered. This is layer 2, playing out over seconds to minutes. The vasodilation cascade from nitric oxide release is propagating. Your peripheral blood vessels are relaxing. The resistance in your vascular bed is falling. Your heart does not need to push as hard against that resistance. Your cardiac load is decreasing. Meanwhile, the pre-vitamin D3 your skin produced in picoseconds is being thermally isomerized to vitamin D3 over the next few minutes. A slower process driven by body heat rather than light. This D3 will reach your liver within hours, be converted to 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and eventually reach the kidney where it becomes the active steroid hormone that enters cell nuclei and adjusts gene expression across 12 tissue types. One afternoon of sunlight exposure is already writing a biological change that will express itself in your cardiac tissue, your immune cells, and your insulin-secreting pancreatic cells by tomorrow. Layer 3. The systemic effect that no one expects. The skin has a nervous system of its own, a peripheral network of sensory fibers, neuropeptide-releasing cells, and immune surveillance cells that collectively constitute what some researchers now call the neuroimmune skin system. When UVB and UVA light strike this system, the response is not only hormonal. Skin cells under UV exposure release beta-endorphin, the same endogenous opioid your brain releases during intense exercise, certain social bonding, and pain relief. A 2017 study by Gillian Fell and colleagues at Harvard examined the endorphin release from mouse skin under UV exposure and found circulating levels sufficient to produce measurable behavioral effects. The mice sought UV exposure. They showed preference for it in a dose-dependent way. When the researchers gave them naloxone, an opioid blocker, the preference disappeared. The skin, bathed in sunlight, was quietly producing a molecule your brain uses to signal profound physiological rightness. Not from the brain, from the skin. Going up. Compare this with what the pharmaceutical industry charges to achieve any one of these 3 effects independently. A vasodilator prescription for blood pressure management. Ongoing cost, side effect profile, no systemic hormonal benefit. Vitamin D3 supplementation at therapeutic doses. Effective for some aspects of the hormonal pathway, but without the endorphin release, without the nitric oxide cascade, without the circadian light signal to the skin's own melanopsin system, without the spectral complexity that activates multiple photoreceptive pathways simultaneously. A synthetic opioid for mood or pain. The pharmaceutical one is also binding to your endorphin receptors, but at doses that rapidly dysregulate the very system it targets, with dependence risk and without any cardiovascular or hormonal side benefit. 3 pharmaceutical interventions, 3 ongoing costs, 3 sets of side effects, 0 integration. Sunlight on skin does all 3 simultaneously, for free, in approximately 20 minutes, with a precision of spectral tuning that took 400 million years to optimize. That is not a coincidence of biology. That is physics recognizing its own input signal. If you are finding this as unexpectedly significant as it sounds, subscribe now and hit the like button. The next 3 blocks are where the implications get genuinely difficult to unknow. The chronic absence of this transaction in modern life does not feel like an absence. It feels like something else entirely, and that is precisely why it has persisted unnoticed through several generations of indoor work culture. Here is what the body without adequate solar UV exposure accumulates over weeks and months. Serum, 25-hydroxyvitamin D, the circulating precursor that reflects your body's hormonal vitamin D status, begins to fall within 2 to 3 weeks of insufficient sun exposure in adults. By 8 to 12 weeks of consistent indoor living, the majority of people in northern latitudes or consistently sun-avoidant lifestyles have levels that immunologists and endocrinologists classify as insufficient, and a substantial fraction reach levels classifiable as deficient. At those levels, gene expression changes, measurable by microarray, occur in immune cells, in neural tissue, in the cells lining your gut, and in the beta cells of your pancreas that produce insulin. These are not extreme clinical changes. They are gradient changes. The system drifts. It continues functioning, but the quality of the function, the precision, the responsiveness, the inflammatory calibration, shifts. The symptoms of that drift are ones you have felt and attributed to everything except sunlight. The afternoon fatigue that coffee does not fully resolve. The low-grade irritability that floats without a convincing object. The susceptibility to every respiratory virus that circulates in winter. The vague muscular discomfort, not pain, not injury, just an ambient stiffness that makes the body feel older than its years. You attributed these to sleep quality, to stress, to diet, to aging, to the particular hardness of the week. They were, at least in part, the signature of a body producing insufficient hormonal vitamin D, running below its nitric oxide baseline, and operating without the endorphin calibration that 200,000 years of hominid life assumed would arrive every clear day. The reformulation, what you have been calling the baseline discomforts of modern life, are not the neutral state. They are the readout of a photobiological deficit that your body experiences as systemic drift, and your mind experiences as vague, sourceless diminishment. Now consider the time scale. Vitamin D insufficiency accumulates visibly over 8 to 12 weeks of indoor life. Compare that to the rate at which the other great chronic diseases of modernity accumulate: atherosclerosis, type 2 diabetes, the slow neuroinflammatory processes implicated in late-life cognitive decline. These are processes measured in years to decades. They are the full unfolding of the entropy that begins in the shorter cycles. The 8-week drift in vitamin D status is not the disease. It is the opening slope of a gradient that, maintained over years, becomes something harder to reverse. The body without adequate sunlight is not in crisis. It is in slow, quiet drift away from the state it was built to maintain. And the further it drifts, the more energy it takes to reverse the drift. And the more the reversal starts to require pharmacological intervention rather than the simple physical input that would have prevented the drift in the first place. This is the entropy framing. Every physical system tends toward lower organization without the energy input that maintains its structure. The human body, on the photobiological axis, is no different. The input is spectral. The organization it maintains is endocrine, cardiovascular, and immune. Remove the input long enough, and the organization softens. The softening has no sharp threshold. It has no single name. It distributes itself across systems as a collection of non-specific complaints that are each too small to treat and together too large to ignore. Now for the connection that will surprise you. The system this script is titled around, photobiology, skin, sunlight, is not the primary beneficiary of the mechanism we have been describing. Or rather, it is, but not in the way the title implies. The organ that may be most profoundly shaped by the chronic loss of adequate sunlight exposure in modernity is the brain. Not because the brain receives sunlight directly. It does not, under normal circumstances. The skull prevents that. But because the three cascades sunlight initiates in the skin, nitric oxide vasodilation, vitamin D hormonal signaling, and beta-endorphin release all converge on the brain through different channels. And the brain, it turns out, was built in an environment where all three of those inputs arrived daily, consistently, for hundreds of thousands of years of hominid evolution, punctuated only by illness or injury. The brain's baseline operating assumption is that these inputs are present. They are not supplements, they are supply lines. The nitric oxide vasodilation cascade improves cerebral blood flow. A 2018 meta-analysis by Mitsuyama and colleagues documented inverse associations between vitamin D status and incidence of late-life cognitive decline across multiple longitudinal cohorts. The neurological vitamin D receptors, VDR, are expressed densely in the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the prefrontal cortex. These are not peripheral tissues experimenting with a novel hormone. These are the brain's most evolutionarily central structures, equipped with the molecular hardware to respond to a signal that was, for all of human evolution, reliably present in the environment every clear day the sun shone on skin. The connection is mediated by a real physical gradient, not merely by biochemical correlation. Ultraviolet photon energy enters the skin, drives a photochemical reaction, and the product of that reaction diffuses through the bloodstream as a lipid-soluble molecule that crosses the blood-brain barrier freely and binds to nuclear receptors inside neurons. The physical field of sunlight, striking skin, writes a chemical message into the neural tissue of the brain. The gradient runs from photon to skin molecule, to blood, to neuron, to gene expression. The chain is physical at every link. Why does the body have this mechanism at all? Because for 4 million years of Homo and pre-Homo hominid lineage, and for the 300 million years of tetrapod vertebrate ancestry before that, clear skin was exposed to direct sunlight during the day, every day, as a structural feature of being alive on the surface of the Earth. Not as a wellness practice, not as a behavior choice, as the unavoidable physics of existing on a planet orbiting a star at this distance without a roof. 10,000 years of enclosed agriculture and 200 years of industrial indoor work have not produced a body adapted to fluorescent ceiling panels. They have produced a body running on a 4-million-year-old photobiological operating system, deprived of the spectral inputs that operating system was written to receive, and quietly compensating in ways that accumulate as the texture of modern unwellness. This is not a critique of indoor life. It is a statement about mismatch. Your body is not broken. It is running ancient code in an environment that the code was not written for. The code works. It just works better with the inputs it was designed to use. The minimum effective dose, based on current evidence, is lower than most people expect and higher than most people currently achieve. For fair to medium skin tones at midday in summer at mid-latitudes, Richard Weller's group and subsequent researchers have worked with exposure times in the range of 10 to 20 minutes of direct sun on meaningful skin surface area, arms and legs, not just hands and face. This window captures both the UVB needed for vitamin D synthesis and the UVA driving the nitric oxide cascade. The nitric oxide effect begins within minutes. The endorphin response is measurable within a comparable window. The vitamin D synthesis, because it involves subsequent thermal isomerization and hepatic conversion, takes longer to express. But the photolytic first step, the one only sunlight can drive, happens in the first minutes of exposure. Position matters for a physical reason. Sunlight at a low angle, early morning or late afternoon in winter, travels through more atmosphere before reaching your skin. The atmosphere filters UVB preferentially. At angles below roughly 30 degrees above the horizon, the UVB component that drives vitamin D synthesis is largely absent. You can get warmth, visible light, mood effects from the melanopsin pathways, but the photolytic step in the 7-dehydrocholesterol molecule requires the shorter wavelength photons, and those are the ones the atmosphere absorbs most readily at oblique angles. This is not a theoretical concern. It is the geometric physics of the sun's path through atmosphere. In winter, at latitudes above approximately 35 degrees north or south, effective vitamin D synthesis from sun exposure may be impossible for months, regardless of how much time you spend outdoors. This is not failure. This is the tilt of the Earth's axis, creating a spectral gap in the seasonal light supply. And it is part of why human populations that spent winters in northern environments historically consumed diets rich in cold-water fatty fish, one of the few dietary sources of pre-formed vitamin D3. What to notice as a signal that the mechanism is active? Within 10 to 20 minutes of real sun exposure on significant skin surface area, most people report a subtle warmth that is distinct from ambient temperature, a sensation in the skin itself rather than on it. This is partly vasodilation. The capillaries in the exposed skin are responding to the nitric oxide signal. Some people notice a faint shift in mood tone, a mild brightening, not euphoria, that is difficult to attribute to anything specific. This is likely the beginning of the endorphin response. Neither of these is placebo. Both have measurable physiological correlates. If you feel neither, it may mean the angle of the sun is too low, the skin surface too small, or the time too short. Adjust one of those variables. For those with significant photosensitivity, histories of skin cancer, or medical conditions that make UV exposure genuinely contraindicated. This is a conversation with your physician, not a YouTube script. The mechanism is real, but so are the individual variations in skin response, and the intent here is never to override medical guidance. The error that nullifies the mechanism: glass. Standard window glass transmits visible light and most infrared, you feel the warmth, but blocks UVB almost completely, and reduces UVA significantly depending on glass type. Sitting in a sunny room behind a closed window feels like sun exposure, but is, photobiologically, a different transaction. Your melanopsin pathways may receive the blue light signal. Your vitamin D synthesis does not occur. The nitric oxide cascade is attenuated. The light that comes through glass is real light. It is just not complete light. The incomplete version maintains mood somewhat, warms the room, and signals daytime. It does not maintain the photobiological baseline your skin was built to receive. If you have made it this far, and you are now rethinking what you assumed was a purely cosmetic or cancer risk question about sun exposure, leave a comment below with the answer to this. Before today, which of the 3 cascades described in this script did you know sunlight triggered in the skin? The vitamin D synthesis, the nitric oxide vasodilation, or the beta-endorphin release? And which one surprised you most? There is something worth sitting with here, at the end of this. Every star radiates. Every planet with an atmosphere filters what it receives. And every living thing that evolved on the surface of a planet around a star evolved in permanent, intimate conversation with the specific electromagnetic spectrum that star produced at that planet's orbital distance. This is not romantic language. This is the physics of where biology happened. Life on Earth did not evolve and then encounter sunlight as a resource it could optionally exploit. It evolved inside sunlight, from the beginning, as a condition of existing at all. The first photosynthetic cells, 3.5 billion years ago, were built to harvest photons. Every lineage that descended from them, every bacterium, every plant, every animal, every vertebrate that eventually stood upright on a savanna and looked at the sky, inherited some version of that original conversation between living tissue and the electromagnetic output of a nearby star. Your skin is not a surface. It is an antenna that your body extended over 400 million years of vertebrate evolution toward the only light source the solar system offers. The antenna is still there. It still works. It is still tuned to the same frequencies it has always been tuned to. What changed is not the skin. What changed is the light. And that gap between the spectrum the antenna was built to receive and the spectrum modern life provides is not a modern health problem. It is a physics problem. The wrong frequencies are arriving. The right ones are available, free, every clear day, approximately 8 minutes after they leave the sun's surface and travel 93 million miles to reach this atmosphere. They are not waiting for a prescription. They are not waiting for a study. They are arriving at your skin's outermost layer with the same spectral profile they had when your lineage first developed the molecular machinery to read them. The oldest information in biology, delivered daily, still looking for someone to receive it.